As many of us know, we found out this morning that 2 victims of a terrorist shooting attack in Tel Aviv were named Tomer Morad and Eitam Magini. They were friends, both aged 27. They were sitting at the Ilka bar on Dizengoff Street last night when a Palestinian terrorist opened fire in the midst of the bar. Terrorist was also just a year older than them, 28-year-old resident of Jenin. He was shot later that evening by security forces. And then just a few moments before services, it was announced that there's a 3rd victim, fatality from the shooting. Israeli Barak Lufan, who's 35, father of 3, is a Paralympics and Olympic kayaking team coach. The Prime Minister of Israel, Naftali Bennett, I think accurately stated, all of Israel shares this grief, which is to say, this is not only felt by the immediate circles of these families, but by the entirety of a country. I've had the unfortunate privilege of being with Israeli friends and colleagues when an attack like this takes place. And while we can sit on one side of the world and offer condolences and feel the tragedy of the moment, it's easy to see when you're with Israelis sitting in America while something like this happens in Israel that we have very different experiences. There's a rush of attention to check in on everyone you know, a rush filled with fear, and so they start calling their friends. And as was reported in the Times of Israel article, something that struck me as something I've watched happen, when your friends don't answer after 2 hours, and you knew they were in that area, you know that they were a casualty. And so there's this immense fear from this having happened time and time and time again, and Israel being a small country, and people knowing that if your friend said, I'm going to Dizengoff Street, that there are only so many bars that they might be in, and that if they don't answer their cell phone, that you already know what the news is. Second, there's a sense which surprised me, a sense of guilt and failure. The Israeli Defense Force is well aware of the threat of a terrorist. Israel has one of the strongest intelligence agencies in the world, and as we all know, extensive security measures at every border with walls and fences and cameras, checkpoints. And so the second thing I've noticed in friends who watch something happen in their country is that there's a feeling that someone or something in this very well-developed, intense, expensive, perfected system, something broke. Someone didn't do their job. Some system didn't do what it was supposed to do, because it's not surprising that someone would try to attack a bar in Tel Aviv. We know that's going to happen. So why didn't we stop this one? Some of the blame falls on us. We need to find out who made a mistake. And third, there are emotions that don't go away in the days or weeks that follow. There are emotions that seem to get planted and stay perhaps eternally with people once they've experienced something like this. That something is what we often call trauma. We know it from our own experience. Jewishly, we can think back a few months ago to Colleyville. Perhaps you've had your own experience with trauma, as many of us have. Abuse, loss, often grief is described personally as a traumatic event that other people see, but they don't truly understand because it's not their trauma. One of the tricky things about trauma is that it doesn't just exist in a moment. It lasts far longer than we would ever imagine it could. Rabbi Paul Kipnis serves a congregation in Calabasas, and some of you may remember this as I mentioned it in the moments when it happened. But he wrote extensively about the 11-day period that began with the attack on the Tree of Life Synagogue in Pittsburgh. His synagogue, like ours, watched very closely, as I think it's fair to say most of the country and certainly all Jews did, when the mass shooting happened at the Tree of Life and 11 people lost their lives. But for his congregation, 10 days later, in their neighborhood, there was another mass shooting at a local bar, and one of his own college students was in the bar while the shooting happened. And then the next day, there was a huge forest fire in their neighborhood. 75% of the congregation was expelled from their homes, and the fire came within 30 feet of the synagogue. 3 massive events in 11 days. So what does Paul write, reflecting back on this years later? He said, here's just one example of what trauma feels like. After going through that in the moment, months later, a friend of his who's a social worker asked me, "How are things with your family?" And I confessed, my wife and I just had an argument, which became something much bigger than the issue deserved. We had to figure out this issue, but in no way did it require the intensity I brought to it. That intensity stemmed from the trauma that started in those 11 days. And so if we know that, then we know that these 3 weeks of terror attacks in Israel are not going to end next week. That 3 months from now, somebody's going to be having an argument with their wife, and they're not going to be able to keep their emotions in check. That what happened this week is going to last for months or years, as it does in our own lives. But I want to shift to our holiday coming up in 1 week. Sometimes we look at our holidays and our sacred texts and we say, well, these people don't really know what they're talking about when it comes to modern issues of trauma or psychology. And sometimes we can be really smart to take the other tack and say, what if the people who put together our Haggadah, these rabbis who had no college education, who knew nothing of Freud, what if they were brilliant in their own way? So let's take the second path. Most Haggadot and most of our Passover Seders, as we will be reminded next week, we get to the middle of the Seder, a little bit before the food, we dip our finger into the wine and we take 10 drops of wine out and we mention each of the plagues. And then most of us, which is exactly what's in most of the Haggadot that we use, immediately after dipping our finger 10 times, we start to sing Dayenu. That it would have been enough. And we love singing Dayenu. And we wipe off our hands and we're getting closer and closer to the meal. But in a traditional Haggadah, there's a passage often skipped. You finish dipping your finger 10 times and saying the plagues, and you're supposed to read the following. If the Egyptians suffered 10 plagues by God's finger, they suffered 50 by God's hand at the sea. Rabbi Akiva multiplies even further. He says each plague was really 5 plagues. So in Egypt, they suffered 50 plagues. And by the sea, they suffered 250 plagues. This is what it sounds like to understand trauma. 1 traumatic event is really 5. 10 plagues is really 50. 50 lost lives is really 250 terrible events happening over and over again. And the Haggadah that my family uses, that I think I'm the only one in my family who likes, but so far nobody's left the table, it imagines what these added plagues were. It says the following. The Egyptians who survived the plagues could not escape the plague of their memories. Their nostrils had sniffed the air of fiery hailstones falling from the sky, and their noses still burned. And their bodies moved slowly because during the plague of darkness, they couldn't see where to walk, and so they never stopped walking slowly. The plague continued. And then there was the plague of grieving the ones that they had lost, the firstborn. And then there was the plague of doubt for what they could have done differently but didn't. And then there was the plague of shame for what happened. And then there was the plague of helplessness because they couldn't save themselves. So 3 young Israelis sat in a bar this week. They were 27 and 35 respectively, and they arrived early to meet other friends. We can be sorry and saddened, but we have to recognize that our friends across the ocean are likely feeling the pain of a plague, the multiplication of trauma that won't end with the next news cycle, the rippling effects that will come for months, fights with spouses, grief revisited of previous losses, fear perhaps to go get a beer. And maybe, as we've seen in our own selves, vengeance for the enemy and anyone associated with them. In trauma, plagues are multiplied. One thing we can do is recognize that that is the case. Acknowledge it when it happens, which is why at Passover next week, we will mark 10 plagues on our plate to mark each single one. And then we won't read the passage probably that I just mentioned, but maybe we'll think about it for a second and say these 10 marks on my plate, it was really 250. And then we'll turn to Dayenu. And we'll introduce Dayenu with a rhetorical mathematical question, except we usually skip this part too. So let me share it with you. The Haggadah traditionally has an introduction to Dayenu before we start singing. It's the following words. Ironically, if you know modern Hebrew, it's mathematical words. Kama ma'alot tovot lamakom aleinu. How many degrees of goodness has God bestowed upon us? Ilu hotzianu. We begin to sing. It asks us to count how many good things came out of that one event. If we were just brought out of Egypt, Dayenu, that one would have been enough. Ilu natan lanu, if we were just given Shabbat, if we were just given the Torah, that would have been enough. If the plagues are mathematical multiplication, one plague becomes 250. Dayenu is division. It says that the one moment, the exodus of freedom, is actually millions of moments. We weren't just freed from slavery, we were given Shabbat and Torah and holidays, song and dance and prayer and peoplehood. Dayenu says, don't look at one great moment as one at all. Divide it into all of the little pieces that are good to have. Dayenu says our cup overflows. And so in the closing remarks of his reflection, Rabbi Kipnis, who had those terrible 11 days and the many months and years that followed, he shares the Jewish prayer for surviving something scary. With a little adaptation, it reads as follows. Blessed are you, eternal our God, guide of the universe, who nurtures among those of us plagued a sense of goodness within us, and who, through blessedly caring souls, continues to remind me of my goodness within. There may not be a way, or at least an easy way, to erase the lasting effects that we've experienced that traumatize us in some way. The nature of trauma is that it multiplies. But Dayenu reminds us that every single blessing we've received is filled with countless other blessings. I pray that as we enter into Passover, as we count plagues, that we also count all the blessings we have. Let's acknowledge the trauma that others are facing in these moments, especially that our friends in Israel are feeling this week, as they felt last week and the week before. And then together, all celebrate Passover around our respective tables everywhere in the world and say, Dayenu, let's now count our blessings, and let's divide them and count every little piece so that our children hear all the ways in which we are blessed and remind ourselves how lucky we are. Shabbat Shalom and an early Hag Pesach Sameach.